January 17th, 1945. A bitter wind cuts through the ruins of a small German town. Roofs lie shattered, windows gaping like empty eyes, and the streets are thick with frozen mud. Smoke still curls from collapsed buildings where families once lived. The bitter scent of ash and cold steel hangs in the air. Among the rubble, a group of women huddles together, their faces pale from hunger and fear. Their children cling to tattered coats, eyes wide with exhaustion and uncertainty. Every footstep echoes against the broken walls, a reminder of the war that has consumed their lives. From the horizon, the low hum of engines grows steadily. Trucks, painted olive drab, roll cautiously into the streets. Soldiers, faces firm yet attentive, carry crates marked with the Red Cross. Bread, canned meat, powdered milk, simple provisions that in this moment feel like miracles. The women stare, disbelief etched into their expressions. Tears form silently as the first packages are lifted down. After months of deprivation, the first taste of warmth, sustenance, and compassion reaches their hands. Relief and astonishment mingle, an emotion they had almost forgotten. The moment is quiet, fragile, yet transformative. By the winter of 1944, Germany was a nation on the brink. Cities that had once thrived with industry, culture, and community now lay in ruins. Allied bombing campaigns, relentless and precise, had reduced factories, railway lines, and homes to rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, each name carried a weight of devastation. The Luftwaffe, Germany's once proud air force, had been decimated. The sky no longer offered protection. It had become a theater of fear. Civilian life had grown increasingly desperate. Food rationing, in place since 1939, had tightened to near impossibility. Potatoes, turnips, and meager portions of bread were stretched to feed entire families. Winter added a cruel layer. Coal and firewood were scarce, leaving homes cold and damp. Children, women, and the elderly suffered first. Malnutrition became visible in hollowed faces, stunted growth, and a silent collapse of community structures. Many towns relied on local gardens and whatever stores they could scavenge from bombed-out warehouses. Hunger was no longer a background detail. It was a constant pressing presence. The Allied advance on the western and southern fronts intensified the pressure. By late 1944, American forces had crossed the Siegfried Line and were moving rapidly through Rhineland towns. Supply lines stretched thin on both sides. German authorities, often overwhelmed by collapsing infrastructure and the retreating front, struggled to maintain order or provide relief. Propaganda sought to mask the suffering, but the reality on the ground was stark. Civilians hid in shelters while supply trains were redirected to the front lines, leaving towns like those on the Rhine increasingly desperate. Amid this devastation, the Allies faced a dilemma. While military objectives demanded rapid advancement, the presence of civilians in ruined towns could not be ignored. American commanders recognized that liberating territory meant more than defeating German soldiers. It also required addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis. This was not a matter of charity. It was strategic, psychological, and moral. Hunger could break civilian morale, but it could also demonstrate the contrast between Nazi promises and American discipline, care, and resources. The military logistics behind delivering food were formidable. American supply convoys, often composed of trucks, jeeps, and occasionally airdrop supplies, had to navigate roads clogged with refugees, destroyed bridges, and the remnants of retreating German forces. Soldiers faced the dual challenge of moving quickly to support the front while ensuring that civilians, previously enemy subjects, were reached safely. The Red Cross and other Allied relief organizations coordinated closely, cataloging towns, estimating population needs, and preparing crates with shelf-stable food. Each shipment was a meticulous operation. Bread was baked in mobile bakeries, meat preserved in tins, powdered milk and sugar carefully measured. Every crate symbolized both sustenance and a statement that the war's human cost could be mitigated even amid destruction. German civilians, largely cut off from news beyond their towns, could only guess at the wider progress of the war. Radio broadcasts were limited, often censored, and rumors spread quickly. Families whispered about American advances, the fall of cities, and the unfamiliar sight of foreign soldiers in uniform. Many women, tasked with protecting children and elderly relatives, carried the weight of uncertainty alongside starvation. The arrival of supply trucks, then, was as much an emotional shock as a practical relief. In towns along the Western Front, civilians had endured repeated bombing raids. Windows shattered, walls scorched, and streets littered with debris became daily reminders of the war's relentlessness. When American planners decided to deliver food directly into these areas, it was a calculated effort to maintain order and project both mercy and authority. Soldiers were briefed on civilian needs, with the understanding that acts of care could foster trust, reduce chaos, and subtly erode Nazi ideological control. For the women and children receiving aid, these trucks were not simply vehicles. They were symbols of a different world, a stark contrast to months of hunger, fear, and isolation. The air in these towns was heavy with cold and smoke, a combination that sharpened senses and heightened emotions. When the American convoys arrived, engines rolling over icy roads, civilians observed from behind broken walls and shattered fences. The sensory impact was immediate. The scent of fresh bread, the clink of tin cans, the murmur of organized soldiers distributing supplies. After months of deprivation, the first real taste of sustenance seemed almost surreal. It was an encounter that combined the tactical movements of military planning with the deeply human reaction of relief, astonishment, and gratitude. These scenes, repeated across towns and villages, set the stage for the intimate moments we witness in January 1945. German women, the backbone of families amid collapse, confronted both the enormity of loss and the unexpected presence of aid. Their tears were not merely personal. They reflected the collective shock of a civilian population long denied security, warmth, and nourishment. The delivery of food to German civilians was not an ad hoc operation. It was the product of meticulous planning and coordination. By late 1944, American military logistics had become a marvel of modern warfare. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles from ports in France, through liberated territories, and into war-torn Germany. Every truck, every crate, every ration was accounted for. Engineers repaired roads, bridged rivers, and cleared debris, ensuring that essential goods could reach civilians even in the midst of combat operations. The Red Ball Express, the famed convoy system that had previously supplied Allied forces after the Normandy landings, served as a blueprint. While its primary purpose was military, fuel, ammunition, and vehicle parts, the principles applied to civilian aid. Convoys moved in carefully coordinated waves, escorted by military police to prevent accidents, looting, or interference from desperate civilians. Every route was reconnoitered, every town cataloged, and every shipment verified. Military planners understood that the appearance of aid could have psychological effects as profound as any artillery barrage. Civilians were not the only recipients. Displaced persons, former forced laborers, and prisoners of war, often in dire conditions, were integrated into distribution plans. Many German women had cared for such groups in secret or within makeshift shelters. The arrival of American aid often reached these hidden populations first, amplifying the sense of disbelief. Reports from the field describe women kneeling to kiss crates of bread, while children clutched tins of condensed milk as if they were treasures. These moments were photographed and recorded in official Allied dispatches, though always with care to protect the identities of civilians. American soldiers assigned to these missions carried both supplies and an awareness of their symbolic importance. Officers briefed men on cultural sensitivity, encouraging calm, respectful interaction. Crates were labeled clearly with the Red Cross symbol, a visual reminder that the aid was humanitarian, not an act of conquest. Soldiers distributed food in organized lines, ensuring fairness and minimizing the potential for panic. In some cases, women assisted in sorting, carrying, and organizing provisions. These interactions, though simple, bridged a divide years in the making, a divide created by ideology, propaganda, and the chaos of total war. The logistical challenges were compounded by winter weather. Snowstorms blanketed roads, rivers swelled with meltwater, and frost formed in the early mornings. Drivers navigated narrow streets, choked with debris, sometimes under the threat of unexploded ordnance. Yet the operation continued, a testament to both planning and determination. Each successful delivery reinforced the Allies' dual objectives: immediate relief for civilians and demonstration of moral authority over the collapsing German regime. German women, meanwhile, had lived through years of deprivation, isolation, and fear. They had scavenged in bombed homes, rationed meager supplies, and tried to maintain a semblance of family structure amid chaos. Many had seen neighbors disappear or die from starvation, disease, or bombing raids. The arrival of food trucks, driven by soldiers who had until recently been the enemy, challenged every assumption they had held. Relief and suspicion coexisted in the same glance. Could this generosity be trusted? Was it a military ploy or a genuine humanitarian effort? The answers would reveal themselves slowly as convoys reached the heart of towns and families received tangible support. Historians note that these aid operations were unprecedented in scale for active combat zones. American logistics had matured to the point that they could feed both soldiers at the front and civilians in occupied territory simultaneously, a feat few armies in history had managed. Records from a U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps detail thousands of tons of rations delivered weekly, including bread, meat, powdered milk, and sugar. Field reports describe American bakeries operating near the front, preparing thousands of loaves daily. Trucks and jeeps transported the rations directly to city centers, while small teams coordinated distribution in the streets, sometimes under the watchful eye of local authorities still aligned with the collapsing Nazi infrastructure. For the German population, the operation represented more than nourishment. It was a tangible demonstration that the war's human dimension had shifted. Civilians could witness that the Americans were organized, capable, and humane in a way that contrasted sharply with their recent experiences. Women, often the caretakers of families and entire neighborhoods, interpreted these deliveries as both reassurance and a subtle declaration that survival was possible even amid destruction. In many towns, mothers documented the events in diaries, and local pastors recorded accounts of stunned families receiving food in snow-covered streets. These first-hand observations provide historians today with vivid testimony of the civilian experience during the final months of the European conflict. By the time the first convoys arrived in January 1945, the stage was set for the intimate, human encounters that would define this period. German women, exhausted, wary, and often grieving, met soldiers with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The careful orchestration of logistics, planning, and cultural awareness ensured that these moments were not chaotic, but structured, measured, and profoundly human. What began as military necessity had evolved into an act that would leave emotional, historical, and moral echoes long after the last crate was distributed. These operations led directly to the personal, emotional scenes we began with: the Hook, where women, finally seeing sustenance arrive in bombed streets, reacted with tears of relief and astonishment. 1. Human angle, civilians and women. 4 German women. The arrival of American food was a profound shock. Years of rationing, fear, and destruction had honed their resilience, yet nothing prepared them for the sight of organized aid entering their streets. Mothers, clutching children in thin coats, froze as trucks rolled past shattered walls. The crates, marked clearly with the Red Cross, were symbols of a world that had seemed almost imaginary in recent months. Eyewitness accounts describe women bending to touch the bread, examining tins of meat as if confirming their existence. The combination of hunger, cold, An uncertainty had numbed hope, and the realization that help had arrived unleashed a torrent of emotion. Tears formed silently, shared among neighbors who had endured the same hardships. For many, the act of receiving sustenance was intertwined with trust, a trust extended to former enemy soldiers now standing before them. These women were not passive recipients. Some assisted in carrying boxes to households, organizing lines of children and elderly neighbors, or distributing food to relatives hidden in cellars. Their engagement transformed the simple act of receiving aid into a communal effort. Emotional responses were immediate and raw: shock, gratitude, disbelief, and cautious relief. This human angle underscores how war's impact is measured not only in destruction, but in the moments when survival and humanity intersect. 2. Technological angle, vehicles and logistics. The delivery of aid relied on cutting-edge logistics for the era. Trucks, jeeps, and mobile bakeries were adapted to navigate war-torn roads, icy streets, and debris-strewn avenues. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps maintained meticulous schedules, mapping routes to avoid bottlenecks or areas of remaining German resistance. Each convoy had to account for terrain, weather, fuel availability, and potential mechanical failures. Vehicles themselves were engineering feats. Studebaker trucks, with reinforced chassis and all-wheel drive, could traverse icy streets where standard trucks would have faltered. Mobile kitchens prepared thousands of loaves of bread per day, baked fresh near the front lines to ensure delivery without spoilage. Crates were designed for rapid handling, stacked efficiently in trucks to optimize space. Soldiers, trained in both combat and supply operations, coordinated these deliveries with precision. The combination of mechanical reliability and organizational skill made the humanitarian operation possible at a scale previously unseen in European conflict zones. These technologies were not abstract tools. They directly impacted civilians' experiences. A truck that could navigate a collapsed bridge meant a child could receive milk that day. A mobile bakery operating near a bombed city ensured bread arrived fresh, signaling stability amid chaos. The effectiveness of technology transformed logistics from mundane supply into a dramatic, life-saving act with immediate emotional resonance. 3. Tactical angle, route planning and convoy strategy. Every convoy route was chosen with both strategy and caution. Engineers mapped roads that had survived bombings, detoured around destroyed bridges, and anticipated flooding or snowdrifts. Military police escorted trucks, not only to enforce discipline, but to ensure that civilians and soldiers interacted safely. Convoys often moved in staggered formations, maintaining communication through radio while scouting ahead for obstacles or remnants of German defenses. Timing was critical. Convoys were often scheduled to arrive in towns before dawn or during early morning hours, minimizing civilian panic while maximizing the visibility of aid. Small units coordinated the distribution once trucks entered towns, establishing temporary checkpoints or distribution points. Soldiers worked quickly, aware that lingering too long could create crowds or provoke unrest. The tactical precision behind each delivery was as important as the supplies themselves. The integration of tactical foresight and humanitarian goals reveals an often overlooked dimension of warfare, that logistical mastery can shape human experience as profoundly as combat. For German women, this meant that food arrived orderly, efficiently, and safely, reinforcing the perception of Americans as organized, capable, and unexpectedly compassionate. The contrast between chaos and careful execution heightened the emotional impact, making the aid not only nourishment, but a statement of operational and moral superiority. 1. Leadership angle, Allied commanders and planners. The orchestration of food deliveries in war-torn Germany was a deliberate decision made at the highest levels of Allied command. Generals and quartermasters recognized that the final months of a European conflict required more than combat victories. They required a demonstration of moral authority. Leaders such as General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his logistical teams understood that civilian cooperation, or at least acquiescence, would ease the advance and stabilize liberated areas. Planning began months in advance. Towns were surveyed, populations estimated, and convoys allocated according to priority. Officers had to balance two competing imperatives: maintaining momentum on the front lines and ensuring civilians were reached safely. Every crate of food, every truck dispatched, was a product of careful decision-making, merging military efficiency with humanitarian foresight. Leadership extended beyond mere orders. It involved cultivating trust among soldiers tasked with distribution, preparing them for interactions with civilians, and instilling a sense of responsibility for the broader consequences of their actions. These leadership choices amplified the emotional impact of the deliveries. German women, often unsure of what to expect, encountered soldiers who were not merely present but organized, calm, and respectful. The visible discipline and forethought in the operation underscored the contrast between the Allied forces and the collapsing Nazi regime, reinforcing both practical and psychological effects of the aid. 2. Enemy angle, German authorities, and local officials. Not all reactions were passive or welcoming. German officials, both military and civilian, were confronted with a dilemma. On one hand, they were responsible for maintaining order, even as the regime crumbled. On the other, they witnessed their authority undermined by the organized arrival of American aid. Some local officials attempted to control distribution, insisting that they oversee who received provisions. Others remained silent, observing the American operation with a mix of suspicion and resignation. The presence of foreign soldiers distributing supplies in occupied towns challenged Nazi propaganda. Citizens, particularly women, saw a side of the Americans that contradicted the vilified image fed to them for years. For German authorities, the deliveries were a reminder of lost control, a psychological blow as much as a logistical one. Diaries and reports from the period note the quiet tension. Officials monitored convoys, but the sheer efficiency and civility of the operation left little room for interference. This duality, the awe of civilians and the unease of authority, heightened the significance of the aid. Women in particular were at the center of this dynamic. They observed, assessed, and responded, often mediating between distrusting officials and unfamiliar soldiers. Their reactions reveal the complex interplay of human emotion, societal structure, and military operations during the final months of the war. 3. Moral/psychological angle. Civilians and soldiers. Beyond the immediate physical relief, the aid had profound moral and psychological implications. For civilians, especially women and children, the arrival of food represented a break in the cycle of fear, hunger, and deprivation. Months of uncertainty and grief were momentarily suspended as crates of bread, meat, and milk were distributed. This emotional release was compounded by the care and attention of American soldiers, who treated recipients with dignity. For the soldiers themselves, the operation carried moral weight. Many had seen the devastation of Germany firsthand: bombed homes, exhausted civilians, and the silent suffering of women and children. Delivering aid became not just a duty, but an act that reinforced the humanity of both giver and receiver. Letters and memoirs from soldiers describe moments when women wept openly, clutched their children tightly, or kissed crates of provisions in gratitude. These interactions left lasting impressions, demonstrating the capacity of organized compassion even amid ongoing conflict. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate relief. For German women, the deliveries challenged their perceptions of the enemy, reshaping narratives imposed by propaganda. Hunger had numbed hope, but witnessing care from former opponents reignited it. Soldiers, meanwhile, gained insight into the civilian cost of war, seeing how strategic planning and human empathy could combine to influence morale, trust, and future stability in liberated areas. 4. Cultural and social perspective. The presence of American aid also highlighted cultural contrasts. German society, accustomed to strict hierarchical structures and authoritarian oversight, was confronted with a system that combined order with humanity. Women, often managing households in crisis conditions, observed American efficiency paired with civility. The simplicity of handing out bread and milk became, unexpectedly, a lesson in governance, trust, and social responsibility. In many towns, women recorded their experiences, noting the foreign uniforms, the neat organization, and the courteous manner of the soldiers. These records, preserved in diaries, letters, and local reports, provide historians today with an unparalleled window into the civilian experience of late-war Germany. The deliveries were not just about survival. They were a demonstration of how operational precision, leadership foresight, and human empathy could intersect to create profound emotional and cultural impact. Climax/turning point, Section 1. January 17, 1945. The morning frost glinted off the jagged remains of rooftops, and smoke from smoldering ruins drifted lazily across the narrow streets. In one small Rhineland town, the air was heavy with anticipation, though no one admitted it aloud. Women and children, their coats thin and patched, waited behind walls and collapsed fences, eyes fixed on the distant rumble of engines. The sound was unlike anything they had heard in months, a steady, purposeful hum rather than the erratic scream of bombers. American trucks that had traveled hundreds of miles from liberated France, rolled into the town with precision. Drivers, faces focused but calm, navigated icy roads littered with rubble. Each vehicle carried crates of sustenance, bread wrapped carefully in wax paper, tins of meat stacked neatly, powdered milk measured to exact portions. The Red Cross insignia was prominent, a visual signal that these supplies were humanitarian in nature, not spoils of war. For the women watching, disbelief rippled through the crowd. Months of rationing, fear, and scarcity had honed their expectations. Food would arrive only in small portions, if at all, and often accompanied by chaos or confiscation. Now, orderly soldiers lifted crates from the trucks, forming lines to ensure fair distribution. Mothers stepped forward, tentatively accepting the first packages, their hands trembling from cold, exhaustion, and emotion. Children, sensing the relief of their mothers, began to peer around corners, curious and cautious. A young girl held a small tin of powdered milk against her chest, as though protecting a treasure. An older woman clutched a loaf of bread, eyes brimming with tears. Silence fell over the street. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but a fragile pause, a moment suspended in disbelief. Then murmurs of gratitude began to spread, quiet words at first, then a gentle chorus of sighs, soft laughter, and whispered prayers. The soldiers maintained discipline, yet their own faces betrayed subtle reactions. They recognized the depth of suffering they had stepped into. Many had witnessed the destruction of German towns during air campaigns or seen the faces of malnourished civilians at makeshift shelters. Now, distributing aid directly to families, they became participants in a profoundly human moment. Reports from these convoys describe interactions where soldiers knelt to lift children, assisted mothers with heavy crates, or reassured the elderly that more food would arrive soon. The arrival of aid did more than provide nourishment. It created order amid chaos. Streets that had been sites of fear now contained measured, organized distribution points. Women helped one another, carrying packages to neighbors or guiding children through icy alleys. This collaboration was spontaneous yet essential, reflecting the adaptive resilience of civilian populations. The human drama of hunger, fear, and despair intersected with the discipline and planning of the Allied forces, producing a scene both ordinary and extraordinary. For the women in this town, the deliveries also carried a symbolic weight. Months of propaganda had painted Americans as cruel, distant, or purely militaristic. Here, in the wreckage of their homes, they saw evidence of meticulous care and organization. Every loaf of bread and every tin of meat was a reminder that their suffering had been noticed, that their humanity remained recognized by forces beyond the collapsing Reich. Some women clasped their hands in silent thanks. Others simply wept. These tears were not shameful. They were the release of pent-up fear, exhaustion, and the weight of survival. Journalists and photographers accompanying the convoys captured these moments, though cautiously, to protect civilians. Images of women receiving bread in snow-covered streets, of children's wide-eyed wonder at their first hot meal in months, were documented as both historical record and proof of the effectiveness of Allied humanitarian operations. Officers overseeing the convoys took careful notes on population responses, noting both the practical needs and the emotional reactions. These observations later informed policies for civilian care across liberated regions. The intensity of the moment reached its peak as the last trucks arrived. Streets that had been lined with anxious, tense onlookers now buzzed with the subdued energy of relief. Mothers distributed portions among extended families and neighbors. Children balanced tins and loaves in their small hands, occasionally dropping one and retrieving it with urgent care. Soldiers, having finished unloading, stepped back to observe the effect of their work. The scene was cinematic in every sense. Cold winter light reflecting off snow and debris, human faces marked by exhaustion yet illuminated with awe, the hum of engines receding as the operation concluded. By midday, the transformation was evident. Where fear and scarcity had dominated, there was now organization, nourishment, and a fragile sense of hope. German women, central to the operation's human impact, had navigated the shift from disbelief to cautious acceptance. Their tears, initially a mixture of shock and relief, now mingled with soft laughter and whispered gratitude. The delivery of food had become more than a logistical achievement. It was an emotional turning point, a moment where the war's human dimension intersected with Allied operational planning to create a tangible, transformative experience. As the days progressed, the impact of the food deliveries rippled across the region. Small convoys became coordinated networks, reaching town after town along frozen roads, through bombed-out villages and past rivers still swollen from winter thaw. Each distribution point repeated the pattern first seen in the Rhineland town. Women and children gathering cautiously, expressions oscillating between disbelief and relief as soldiers lifted crates marked with the Red Cross. In one village near the Ruhr, a widowed mother, having scavenged meager rations from the remains of her cellar, received a crate of bread and canned meat. She knelt in the snow, pressing her hands against the provision as if confirming its reality. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of engines and the sight of organized soldiers, clustered nearby, sharing small portions and guiding children carefully. The act of receiving sustenance became a communal ritual, reinforcing bonds among civilians who had endured months of deprivation. American soldiers continued their disciplined work, moving with deliberate efficiency to ensure every household had access. Mobile bakeries stationed near larger towns produced thousands of loaves each day, baked fresh and dispatched in insulated trucks to prevent spoilage. Jeeps and light trucks carried powdered milk, sugar, and other staples to smaller villages where heavier vehicles could not pass. The logistics were staggering, but the effect on civilian morale was immediate. Letters and diaries from the period document the astonishment of women witnessing such scale and coordination. For many, the simple act of receiving bread was transformative, a tangible relief amid months of uncertainty and suffering. The emotional impact was profound. Women often wept openly, hugging children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks, or pausing to absorb the moment fully. Some carried portions to neighbors too frail or elderly to reach distribution points, while others guided children who had wandered from bombed-out homes. The scenes were a mixture of chaos and order, improvisation and discipline, illustrating the resilience of civilians and the meticulous planning of Allied forces. Soldiers observed quietly, aware that these interactions, though brief, were deeply consequential. In larger towns, the convoys took on almost ceremonial significance. School teachers, previously struggling to feed their students, assisted in organizing lines. Local midwives and nurses joined in, ensuring infants and the sick received the first aid. The efficiency and care of the American operation contrasted sharply with the chaos left behind by retreating German authorities and destroyed infrastructure. Women, many of whom had previously been forced to rely on ration cards and illicit scavenging, experienced the aid not only as sustenance, but as a validation of their endurance and resilience. Reports from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps indicate that within weeks, thousands of tons of food had been delivered across the Rhineland, Bavaria, and parts of the Ruhr. Each shipment was documented, noting population numbers, household sizes, and the condition of recipients. Soldiers observed interactions carefully, recording emotional responses, children's laughter, the astonishment of mothers, and the quiet tears of elderly women. These records were later used to refine further operations and to demonstrate to Allied planners the necessity of civilian aid even in active combat zones. The operation also created a subtle shift in regional dynamics. Local German authorities, observing the efficiency of the deliveries, often withdrew interference, recognizing that American discipline outweighed their ability to control the process. Communities, guided by women as both caretakers and organizers, adapted quickly to the new reality. Temporary networks of distribution formed, ensuring that even those in outlying or partially destroyed homes received portions. Women became central figures in maintaining order, demonstrating leadership and resourcefulness amid the upheaval of war. Beyond immediate relief, these deliveries fostered a psychological transformation. Months of fear, hunger, and uncertainty had eroded hope, but now, women observed a tangible change. Soldiers who had been distant invaders became agents of care and stability. The emotional response was profound. Relief interlaced with astonishment, gratitude tempered by the disbelief that such generosity could exist in the heart of enemy territory. In diaries and letters preserved from the time, women described the surreal experience of receiving food from those they had been taught to fear. Their reactions, tears, whispered prayers, gentle laughter, spoke to the human capacity for hope amid destruction. The regional impact was also measurable. Reports from local hospitals and shelters noted improved health among children and the elderly. Malnourishment, previously widespread, began to stabilize as consistent rations arrived. Women, central to household management, found the renewed supplies allowed them to regain a measure of autonomy and control over daily life. Communities that had been fractured by bombing and displacement began to see small signs of cohesion restored. By the end of January 1945, the combination of tactical planning, technological efficiency, and human engagement had reached its zenith. Women, who had suffered the longest and hardest in these towns, now experienced both physical relief and emotional affirmation. Their reactions, tears, astonishment, careful laughter, were mirrored in the diaries, reports, and photographs of soldiers who had participated in the operation. In these moments, the humanitarian mission transcended mere logistics. It became a turning point, not just in the daily survival of German civilians, but in the psychological landscape of a population witnessing the final months of a war that had upended every facet of life. In the days following the convoys, the streets of bombed-out German towns carried a quieter energy than they had for months. Women, who had spent years balancing fear, hunger, and exhaustion, now moved through the ruins with a tentative sense of relief. Children, previously silent or listless from deprivation, laughed softly while sharing portions of bread or tins of meat. The arrival of food had not eradicated suffering, but it had restored something intangible: hope. Local reports from January 1945 describe women organizing neighborhood networks to ensure even the most isolated households received rations. In one Rhineland town, a widow and her teenage daughter coordinated deliveries to 8 neighboring families. Another account details a schoolteacher distributing powdered milk to infants, while older students carried tins of meat to elderly neighbors unable to leave their homes. These acts, small but deliberate, demonstrate how women became central to sustaining community morale after months of devastation. Soldiers accompanying the convoys recorded similar observations. Officers noted the visible astonishment on women's faces as they accepted supplies, the whispered exclamations of relief, and the occasional tears of gratitude. Memoirs from U.S. troops describe quiet moments where mothers held children tightly against the cold while carefully opening tins of food. The contrast between months of scarcity and the arrival of organized, abundant aid created profound emotional resonance. Civilian diaries from the period provide additional context. One entry, dated January 19, 1945, reads, "We have lived in hunger for months, but today, bread and milk arrived. I held my child close, unsure if this was a dream." Another account notes the reactions of elderly women. "We wept quietly. It was not shame but relief. The soldiers treated us with care, as if we mattered." These first-hand testimonies highlight the immediate impact of the deliveries, illustrating both physical sustenance and emotional reprieve. The organized nature of the aid also helped prevent chaos. Military planners anticipated potential unrest, particularly in towns where food had been scarce for months. Distribution points were carefully structured, with women often assisting in line management. Civilians observed order being maintained even amid emotional intensity, reinforcing trust in the Allied operation. For many German women, this order was as significant as the food itself. It conveyed stability, fairness, and a measure of control amid the unpredictable conditions of war. Psychologically, the impact extended beyond relief from hunger. Women, responsible for household survival, were reassured that their immediate needs, and those of their children, would be met. This had cascading effects. Children were calmer, elderly neighbors less anxious, and women able to direct scarce resources more effectively. The deliveries were not merely material. They symbolized the restoration of agency in lives that had been dominated by conflict and deprivation. Reports to American headquarters reinforced these observations. Soldiers detailed both the scale of the operation and its effectiveness in boosting civilian morale. Photographs and written accounts documented women's astonishment, their tears of relief, and the communal sharing of provisions. These reports influenced subsequent planning, demonstrating that strategic humanitarian aid could complement military objectives by stabilizing civilian populations and fostering goodwill, even in enemy territory. The immediate aftermath also revealed a subtle social transformation. Women, often the backbone of these communities, emerged as coordinators and observers, documenting the flow of aid and ensuring equitable distribution. Their roles in organizing households and neighborhoods became more visible, illustrating resilience and resourcefulness in the face of destruction. The combination of Allied planning, logistical execution, and civilian initiative created a temporary, yet powerful sense of stability in towns otherwise defined by chaos. By the end of the first week, the streets that had been silent, tense, and haunted by fear were now filled with quiet, orderly activity. Mothers carried food to families, children played amid snow-covered rubble, and women exchanged relieved glances, sharing whispered words of astonishment and gratitude. The deliveries had achieved more than nourishment. They had restored a fragment of humanity to towns devastated by years of conflict. This immediate impact paved the way for the broader, long-term consequences of the operation: regional stability, psychological reassurance, and the gradual reshaping of civilian perception toward the Allies. Beyond individual towns, the delivery of aid to German civilians had significant regional and strategic consequences. Allied commanders observed that systematic humanitarian operations reduced unrest, stabilized communities, and fostered cooperation in areas previously resistant to occupation. Civilians, particularly women who had endured the brunt of wartime scarcity, became critical intermediaries, organizing neighborhoods, reporting needs, and mediating between soldiers and local authorities. Their role highlighted how grassroots civilian participation could amplify the impact of military planning. For the American military, these operations reinforced the concept that victory extended beyond battlefield success. The ability to provide humanitarian assistance while advancing strategically demonstrated a new model of warfare, one that combined operational efficiency with moral authority. The careful distribution of food, observed and documented meticulously, sent a clear message. The Allies were capable of both destruction and care. Soldiers witnessed firsthand the immediate transformation of civilian behavior. Women guiding children, sharing rations, and rebuilding small community networks. This experience shaped military thinking about occupation, civilian engagement, and post-war reconstruction planning. Psychologically, the effect on German women was profound and enduring. Diaries and letters from the period convey a mixture of disbelief, relief, and tentative hope. For those who had lost homes, family members, or access to regular meals, the organized arrival of provisions was transformative. Mothers reported improved energy in their children, restored capacity for household management, and renewed confidence in their ability to protect their families. The presence of American soldiers, orderly and humane, also challenged decades of propaganda, reshaping perceptions of the enemy in ways that would influence post-war attitudes. Local authorities, initially wary or hostile, gradually adapted to the new reality. The efficiency of aid operations often left them with little choice but to permit distribution rather than interfere. In some towns, previously complicit officials quietly assisted in organizing delivery points, recognizing that the welfare of civilians and the authority of remaining administrative structures depended on cooperation. This shift contributed to the stabilization of communities during the final months of the European conflict, allowing civilians to begin rebuilding lives even as front lines continued to shift. On a broader scale, the operations provided valuable data for post-war reconstruction efforts. Reports detailing quantities of food delivered, population responses, and logistical effectiveness informed Allied policies for the occupation of Germany. The psychological effects on women, documented through diaries, photographs, and field reports, became a key reference point for understanding civilian resilience and the importance of humanitarian engagement in conflict zones. These lessons influenced post-war relief programs across Europe, shaping approaches to displaced persons, famine prevention, and community stabilization. Soldiers involved in the deliveries also recorded lasting impressions. Many recounted the gratitude of women who, despite fear and exhaustion, offered help in distributing supplies or shared small comforts with their deliverers. These interactions reinforced a sense of purpose beyond combat, illustrating the profound human dimension of war. Officers observed that acts of care, combined with operational discipline, had tangible effects on civilian morale, security, and cooperation, proof that humanitarian action could serve both ethical and strategic objectives. By February 1945, the model of aid delivery had expanded into surrounding regions, establishing a precedent for the Allied occupation and post-war relief. German women, central to these communities, retained vivid memories of these interventions. Their experiences, tears of relief, astonishment at organization, and quiet laughter at small reprieves from hunger, formed an emotional and psychological bridge between the destruction of the war and the tentative restoration of daily life. The impact went beyond the immediate distribution of food. It reshaped how civilians engaged with occupying forces and how soldiers understood the responsibilities and possibilities inherent in their presence. In retrospect, these operations illustrate a crucial dimension of warfare often overlooked in military history: the interplay of logistical mastery, moral decision-making, and human psychology. The delivery of food to German civilians, led in part by meticulous planning and facilitated by technology and discipline, created a tangible and lasting difference in lives long defined by loss. For the women who had endured months of deprivation, it was not simply bread that arrived. It was recognition, stability, and the fragile restoration of hope. The image of German women standing among ruins, tears in their eyes as American soldiers handed out bread and milk, endures as a testament to the human dimension of war. These moments were not victories in the conventional sense. No cannons roared, no flags were raised, but they revealed a quieter, equally profound triumph. The restoration of hope amid devastation. Hunger, fear, and isolation had dominated daily life for months. Yet in these small interactions, civility and compassion reasserted themselves. For the women who had endured relentless hardship, the deliveries were both practical and symbolic. Every loaf of bread and every tin of meat represented more than nourishment. It was evidence that the outside world had not abandoned them, that their suffering was seen, acknowledged, and mitigated. In a landscape defined by destruction and loss, these acts restored a fragile sense of dignity and agency. Women became central figures in bridging destruction and recovery, organizing neighborhoods, ensuring equitable distribution, and guiding their families through a world irreversibly changed. From a historical perspective, these operations highlight the intersection of strategy, logistics, and morality. The American forces demonstrated that organized humanitarian aid could serve both practical military purposes and ethical imperatives, stabilizing regions while alleviating human suffering. Soldiers, planners, and civilians were united, if only temporarily, in a shared recognition of humanity that transcended the strict divisions of wartime allegiance. Ultimately, the significance of these events lies not only in the immediate relief they provided, but in the lessons they leave for history. War is often measured in battles and casualties, yet its most enduring legacies are the human stories, the faces, the tears, the quiet acts of care that remind us of resilience, compassion, and connection. In the bombed streets of Germany, amidst ash and rubble, German women cried not only for the loss they had endured, but for the first glimpse of hope in months of despair. In these moments, history reveals itself not only in strategy and destruction, but in the small, profound gestures that restore faith in humanity. And in that fragile, fleeting relief, the true weight of war's human cost and its possibilities for redemption becomes unmistakably clear.